Welcome to Forbes Movies. Joining me now is Scott Mendelson, a Forbes entertainment analyst and box office pundit. Scott, per usual, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure. Always happy to be here.
Great. So let's kick it off. It's Monday. What were the biggest winners and losers at the box office this weekend?
Paramount's Smile was the top grossing film at the domestic box office with approximately $22 million. That's a big win for a $17 million R-rated original. It's based on the director's short film. High concept horror picture that earned good reviews, decent buzz, had a solid 2.65 weekend multiplier. That means it earned 22 million off an $8.2 million Friday. Obviously, you want that multiplier to be higher because that means interest and or buzz isn't front loaded toward the first 24 hours or so. And this was a film that, from what I gather, was supposed to be a Paramount Plus release until they gave it a test screening or two and they liked what they saw. So they gave it a theatrical push and now they get to make money.
And so far, is this the highest grossing weekend for a horror movie coming out this Halloween season?
For Halloween season, yes. Off the top of my head, it's the biggest since Nope with $44 million in early or mid July. And then you had The Black Phone, which made $23 million in late June. That was another new to you horror movie. It's based on a Joe Hill short story. Um, yeah, it's slightly bigger than the $19 million debuts of the Woman King and Don't Worry Darling. It is obviously bigger than the $10 million opening of Barbarian and the $7 million opening of The Invitation. This does imply that, as it was before COVID, and frankly, as it's been for much of COVID, that horror movies are alive and well and are a sturdy and reliable theatrical subgenre. It's been that way at least since A Quiet Place 2 sort of showed us that tent poles are really truly back when it opened with 57 million over Memorial Day weekend 2021. Last summer, you had a lot of horror films like M. Night Shyamalan's Old, The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It, The Forever Purge, etc., that pulled in decent to superlative numbers. Again, horror has generally been reliable. It's cheap. It doesn't have to break records to break even. It is something that's considered a communal experience. And not to be an armchair psychologist here, but in times of peril and strife, horror films are often seen as a healthy and cathartic way to work out real world fears.
So that sounds like is horror the most reliable genre of movies in theaters?
I think so, in terms of, especially when you're considering that they aren't like super duper expensive. Yes, Marvel DC comic book movies are incredibly reliable, but those tend to be pretty pricey. Something like Morbius costing 75 million is the exception rather than the rule. Um, and even there, most of the lower budgeted comic book superhero movies of that ilk costs anywhere from 120 to 150. And of course, the big super duper Marvel movies cost over under 200 million. Ditto the DC event films like the Batman and Wonder Woman 1984 and the Suicide Squad. So in terms of bang for your buck, horror movies are pretty tough to beat.
And so we know Smile was the best performer of the weekend. What was the worst performer?
Well, the only other major opener this weekend was Universal's Bros, a Billy Eichner starring rom-com, written by Nicholas Stoller, and I believe Billy Eichner. I think he co-wrote it, and directed by Stoller. It opened with just $4.8 million over the weekend. I mean, even in terms of live action theatrical comedies, that's worse than Easter Sunday back in early August. This is a you know a an old school box office disaster. It cost $22 million to make. It's probably going to top out at 12. Will EVOD ride to the rescue? Maybe. And I'd like to think so, because again, I've been arguing for a while that PVOD, especially for Universal, has provided this sort of alternate income stream, this alternate revenue stream that isn't cannibalizing theatrical, that gives film, studio programmers, non-franchise, adult skewing, star and/or concept-driven titles, a second chance after theatrical, and in a way that justifies their theatrical release, even if they don't break the bank in theaters.
And Billy Eichner did respond to the poor performance of Bros, and he wrote on Twitter, quote, "Even with glowing reviews, great Rotten Tomatoes scores, an A cinema score, etc., straight people, especially in certain parts of the country, just didn't show up for Bros." So I saw on Twitter you disagreed. Can you elaborate?
Well, I'm certainly sympathetic. He watched his passion project go down in commercial flames, despite good reviews and decent buzz and all that jazz. Um, this is a circumstance where, yeah, it's you could argue that certain demographics did or didn't step up to the plate. But when you have a mainstream theatrical release that opens with $4.8 million, that means nobody showed up. All due respect. This isn't a matter of quote unquote straight people, you know, coming in to support the LGBTQIA rom-com. This is a matter of everybody saying no thank you. And putting aside the discourse, this is an R-rated original rom-com with no stars. All due respect, he's not an opener. I would argue most people outside of Twitter don't know who he is. That's not an insult. That's just the way the world works. And this is a time when, in terms of theatrical comedies, even films from Will Ferrell and Kevin Hart and Melissa McCarthy are going straight to Netflix. Theatrical live action comedies have been in a bad place for the last 4 or 5 years.
Why is that?
Problem.
Because you can watch them for free on Netflix. Well, not for free, but if you have a subscription.
In that comedies have been sort of considered something that you could just watch at home, either for free or on DVD, that you're not losing much if you don't see it on the big screen. Also, comedies were a solid driver even as recently as 2016 because people would show up for a star vehicle in a comic vehicle. If I think I mentioned this last week, I apologize, but it still stands. If you think Kevin Hart is funny, you're not going to care whether the critics trashed his last movie if you thought his last movie was pretty funny. If you liked Ride Along and The Wedding Ringer and what have you, you're not going to care if Night School gets good or bad reviews. That has changed. The subgenre as it is, people don't show up for comedies. It stinks. It's unfortunate. As recently as 2013, you had We're the Millers, a whatever movie that got mixed, lousy reviews, that no buzz. The film still made 250 worldwide in mid-August. Neighbors opened with 49 million, directed by Nicholas Stoller. In early May of 2014, even as recently as 2016, Central Intelligence was a hit. Melissa McCarthy's The Boss was a hit. I mean, the extent to which comedies have become not persona non grata in theaters is terrifyingly fast. And I think this isn't the singular reason, but I think one reason, unfortunately, is that DC and Marvel comic book superhero pictures have made as a part of their package that they're also comedies. So if you want to see a comedy, a lot of the people that don't go to the movies all the time will show up for Deadpool. They'll show up for Spider-Man Homecoming. They'll show up for, even Avengers Infinity War, which has a lot of comedy within the, doom and gloom and Thanos kills the world stuff.
So it's kind of like a 2-for-1 situation there.
That is something that Marvel comic book movies have done in terms of approximating genres, like, Ant-Man is a heist film. Spider-Man Homecoming is a teen coming of age story. Aquaman is an undersea King Arthur flick. Wonder Woman is a World War II epic, etc., etc., etc. Guardians of the Galaxy is an outer space sci-fi fantasy. So you're getting a high quality genre film with characters that you know and like. So when you're confronted with just the genuine article, you're almost getting less value for your dollar.
Okay, and do you know when the last movie was that flopped as badly as Bros?
Well, I mean, Easter Sunday only made 5.5 million on opening weekend, so that's within the margin of error. Marry Me was on Peacock concurrently with theaters, and I think opened with about 7.5 million, did about 23 domestic. I'm going off memory, so I apologize. And so, I mean, comedies have not been doing well in theaters. A lot of them got sold or leased to streamers in the first 2 years of COVID, because again, there was the exception that, when people do come back, they're only going to come back to the biggest, the big. That's somewhat true. Um, but again, that's been a problem before COVID, where quote unquote studio programmers, star vehicles, just a movie movies have been struggling at least since 2016, partially because the audience for that just to, that goes to the movies just to go to the movies, they gravitated to streaming. Um, Now, all is not, all hope is not lost. Sandra Bullock and Channing Tatum's The Lost City did do 105 million domestic and about 190 worldwide on a 70 budget earlier this year. That was a moderate success. Universal has a rom-com coming out starring George Clooney and Julia Roberts called Ticket to Paradise. That opens in October on October 21st. It has been playing overseas, slowly expanding overseas for the last few weeks. It's already made 45 million overseas. I don't know what the budget is. I can't imagine it's more than over under $40 million. So unless it just dive bombs in North America, and again, overseas numbers would suggest otherwise, it is going to be an old school rom-com hit. Unfortunately, those are the exceptions rather than the rules.
And when we see a movie performing well overseas, is that always a clear indicator? Okay, once it comes to the US, it's going to be a hit or not?
There are exceptions, but generally, yes. The notion of a big movie opening overseas way in advance of domestic is a relatively new phenomenon. I'm talking in the last decade. And yeah, there are some times where a movie will open like a week early overseas, or even like with Aquaman, where it opened a week early overseas, but opened 2 weeks early in China just because the Chinese distribution arm opened it earlier than everywhere else. Now, Aquaman made 298 million in China. That's a big reason why it made 1.148 billion worldwide. Jurassic World: Fallen Kingdom opened way in advance of its domestic debut in the summer of 2018, partially to get around the World Cup. There were certain territories that they didn't want to be competition for the World Cup. But again, that movie made $1.308 billion worldwide in the summer of 2018, including 417 worldwide. Generally speaking, movies that do well open overseas first and do well overseas relative to budget and expectations and what have you also do well in North America as well. I'm sure there's some exception that I'm forgetting. And again, remember, Warcraft was not a hit in the conventional sense. Yes, it did 218 million in China, but it just dive bombed in North America. And it was more front loaded in China than it was in North America. It made 90 million in the first 2 days. So by the end of the first weekend, we all knew that that movie was incredibly front loaded because Warcraft was a very popular property. Everybody showed up quickly. They decided they didn't like it and they told their friends not to bother. Comparatively speaking, it was their Batman v Superman. Um,
On a smaller scale of that, do you think we saw that with Don't Worry, Darling this past weekend?
oh, did that open overseas first?
Not so much as overseas. Yes, in front loading, yes.
Generally speaking, that's one of two theories. Oxum's Razor suggests that the B minus cinema score, the mixed reviews, the two, the barely two multiplier suggests that people, the people that wanted to see it showed up last weekend, and word of mouth wasn't enough to preach to the unconverted. So if that's the case, it'll top out at around what's that? I think 35 right now. So 45, 50 million, give or take. And then it'll do about 85 million worldwide on a 35 budget. Not a barn burner, not a franchise spawn, not a blockbuster, but a solid middle of the road line drive to second theatrical hit that will make up any lost whatever on VOD, EST, DVD, and HBO Max. The other possibility, and I'm not advocating this, I'm just curious if this is the case, where maybe the opening weekend was a little juiced by the Harry Styles fans, in the same way that Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness and Captain America Civil War opened the best case scenario box office, partially because you had a subset of Marvel fans that were expecting an Avengers style event movie. And then for the rest of those films runs, because they were both relatively front loaded for a Marvel film, they were both hugely successful regardless. That for the rest of those films runs, they were playing as just a third Captain America movie or just a second Doctor Strange movie. Now, if that's the case, and Don't Worry Darling plays just as a Florence Pugh, Harry Styles, Chris Pine R-rated erotic thriller in the vein of A Simple Favor and the Girl in the Train, then we might see some leveling out over the next few weeks. I don't think it's going to be extreme. It's not like it's going to level out over weekend 3 and then leg out to $70 million. I'm not talking about that. I'm just saying if it sticks around because it's now playing to those who just want what it has to offer, regardless of the Harry Styles factor. And again, I don't want to overinflate his the credit he gets for the opening weekend, because I don't want to, I think there is a tendency in the media to latch onto an SEO friendly reason for a film doing well or poorly, when usually it's more complicated than that. For example, bros bond because straight people didn't show up. That may not be true, but it's a very SEO friendly clickbait quote that you can put in a headline without really interrogating it. But yeah, if that's the case, then yeah, maybe it gets closer to 55 million than 45 million. But again, it's a hit. It's not a blockbuster, but it will do fine.
And I have a question about front loading in general. How do you know after the first week if a movie's going to be front loaded or if it's going to be, a box office success or, leggy?
Generally speaking, if it takes a huge dive in the first, the second weekend, like if a movie makes 100 million in the first weekend and 30 million in the second weekend, a 70% drop, that is a sign that either A, people really didn't like it, or B, those who wanted to see it showed up in the first weekend and the unconverted didn't show up. A good example of that, and I don't have the numbers exactly on my, although if you can stall for me a minute, I can look it up. Hold on.
Yeah, take your time.
The Lionsgate's Power Rangers reboot, a live action picture that came out in 2017, got mixed reviews, but frankly was better than I think most people expecting from a Power Rangers movie. Even as someone who did not like the old show, I pretty much enjoyed the picture. It opened with $40 million, got an A+ from CinemaScore audiences under 18. Everybody assumed it'd be, a long leggy hit. However, it dropped like a stone. It dropped 65% in weekend 2, earned 14.2 million, and then topped out at 85. What happened? Generally speaking, the people that were interested in a Power Rangers movie showed up with bells on, but those who were not interested in a Power Rangers movie were not convinced to see it by the mixed negative reviews and or the better than expected word of mouth. So that's a situation where it wasn't that everybody hated the movie or they got terrible reviews. It was just that those that wanted to show up did, and the brand did not expand beyond the already converted. Now, the more likely example is, a film opens well because of hype and interest, but it's terrible. The reviews are bad. The word of mouth is bad. And then you get Morbius, which dropped like 75% in its second weekend, which was a record for a big deal comic book movie, and topped out at around 65 million from a 39 million opening weekend. Even that's an extreme case, but that's what we're talking about. Now, there are some circumstances where a movie opens so big that it does take a massive drop, but is still okay. When a movie like Spider-Man No Way Home opens with $260 million and then takes a drop of like 67% on the second weekend.
That's still not bad. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So there's another movie that was released, or should I say re-released last week, and that was Avatar. So can we talk about that? So how did the Avatar re-release perform this weekend?
Avatar dropped about 55% on its second weekend, which isn't bad. You have to assume that a lot of the audience that really wanted to see Avatar again or for the first time in theaters did so on opening weekend. It was always going to be a front-load release, and unless something changes, it's not going to be in theaters past Thursday anyway. It's a 2-week special engagement. The film has earned 779 million domestic and 58, and the re-releases earned 58 million worldwide. And if you want to count China, where it made 57 million in 2021, that's another $115 million in Avatar's pocket. That also means it becomes, as of this weekend, the first and so far only movie to make $2.905 billion worldwide. So it's doing fine, and it did the job in the sense of reminding people that Avatar was a fantastic experience in theaters, and sort of restarting the Avatar discourse online with a lot of sort of pushback against the whole nobody liked Avatar, they just showed up because of the 3D, or nobody cares about Avatar anymore, or the film has no pop culture impact. I don't know what idiot wrote that in 2014, but he was dead wrong. At least he admitted his error in 2019.
And today in 2022. But do you think that Avatar: The Way of Water could potentially outperform the first Avatar?
It's gonna be close. And obviously, if this needs to be said, if the film drops by 50% and only makes 1.6 billion, 1.5 billion dollars, oh no. If it's good, if it's well reviewed, if it's well received, because again, you've got three more Avatar sequels on the way. If people hate Avatar 2, then Avatar 3, 4, and 5 are in trouble.
And is it getting a China release as well?
That I don't know, because China has been so nitpicky about Hollywood movies and especially Disney movies. I would guess yes, because A, it's technically a 20th century studio production, and Avatar is popular in China. And quite frankly, China's theatrical business has been hurting this year. It's been doing, I don't have exact numbers in front of me. I'm probably going to pull it up for a post later, but we're in a situation where China needs Hollywood movies more than Hollywood needs China, which is sort of a shoe on the other foot situation.
And how did we get in this situation? Or how did they get in this situation?
I don't want to speak out of turn in terms of politics that are outside of my pay grade, but I do know that China has been a lot finickier about allowing Hollywood films into China compared to 2019 and previously to that. There's been nothing from Marvel, either Disney or Sony, since Spider-Man Far From Home. Yeah, Far From Home. And the films that have played in China have done a lot worse than you might have expected in pre-COVID times. For example, Wonder Woman made 90 million in 2017. Wonder Woman 1984 made 35 million, or I think like 25 million. The Batman only made 20 million. F9, Fast and Furious 9 made 205 million, which to be fair was basically on par with Hobbs and Shaw in 2019, but it was a hell of a lot less than Fate of the Furious and Furious 7, which was about 390 in 2015 and 2017. Again, some of that is just they didn't like the movie. In the same way, the film was very continuity specific, mythology drenched, very fan baity and nostalgia driven, and they didn't care for it. In the same way that they very quickly rejected Detective Chinatown 3, which was also very continuity and mythology drenched. That film opened with $399 million in early 2021, which, by the way, is the biggest opening weekend of all time for any movie in any marketplace. But it quote unquote crashed and burned and had to settle for only $685 million. In other examples, Jurassic World made 227 in China in 2015. Jurassic World made Fallen Kingdom made 262 in 2018, but Jurassic World Dominion only made 160 this summer. That was enough with the help of Japan and China and whatever, to push it past $1 billion worldwide. And it's still the third biggest Hollywood movie in China over the last 3 years, behind F9 and what I'd argue is probably the exception to the rule, Godzilla v Kong, which made 188 million in early 2021. That was a lot more than even Godzilla King of the Monsters, which earned 135 in 2019. But generally speaking, the Hollywood films that have played in China have either outright flopped or have made a lot less than might have been expected in pre-COVID times. Now, the other side of that, is that we've seen a lot of movies that have still kicked ass and taken names without even playing in China, or films that bombed in China.
Like what?
The Batman only made 20 million. It still made 770 worldwide. And don't let anyone tell you that wasn't a top tier performance for that picture. Because it was. They're thrilled. The film cost about 180, got rave reviews, strong cinema score gradings, strong legs. When we get a Batman 2, it will also be a hit. So again, don't let Twitter tell you otherwise. Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness is another good example. Oh no, Marvel is doomed. It only made $955 million. That's like if you take away China, which the first Doctor Strange made about 115 there, the film made like a 71% jump from the first Doctor Strange, which made $677 million worldwide in 2016. The sequel did 955 without China. Top Gun made 1.476 billion and counting without China. Joker, even before COVID, made $1.73 billion without China. Spider-Man No Way Home last December made $1.9 billion without China.
So time and time again, it's proven we don't rely on China to have these box office smash successes.
Exactly. More importantly, or about as important, there was a perception over the last several years that Hollywood had to kowtow to China's cultural sensibilities, at least in terms of the censors. The people are, they have their own tastes and whatever. But now we're in a situation that it's up to China to convince Hollywood that they should give a damn about Chinese wants, needs, and desires.
Got it.
And again, I'm not getting into, that's not a political thing, whatever. China's had plenty of their own homegrown blockbusters that many of them are very good. I think if Hollywood remade Moon Man, which made around, I think that's already made $400 million already. I think they would have a solid little Hollywood it, but whatever. When I talk about China in a broad sense, for the record, I'm talking about the government, not the people.
Of course, of course. And I do want to now switch gears a little bit to a movie that dropped on Disney Plus this past weekend, Hocus Pocus 2. You saw it, you reviewed it, and now let her rip.
Plenty of people, according to the internet, people that, by people that I converse with online that are just in that sweet spot in terms of demographics, that they saw the first Hocus Pocus and they were like, between 6 and 9, they had a good time with it. I won't judge them. No, that's not true. I will judge them. I will judge them harshly. But no, it's basically the exact same movie as the first one, which means a couple kids unleash a few witches on Halloween night. Those witches are played by Kathleen Jimmy, Sarah Jessica Parker, and Bette Midler. And those three overqualified comic performers proceed to basically stand around and quip to each other for 90 minutes. But the jokes aren't very funny. A lot of the culture class humor doesn't make sense. I mean, I don't want to be a nitpicker here, but there's several scenes in which they are shocked and astounded by technology that absolutely existed in 1993, the first time they came back to Salem. But I digress.
So the jokes are a little old, you're saying?
Well, it's confusing because, like, they know what another, they've been to 1993 Salem. They know what a convenience store is. They could have visited a Walgreens or a 7-Eleven, but whatever. Yeah. These are nitpicks that if the movie was any good, I wouldn't care.
But does it matter? Do you think it matters if the movie was good or not? Because people are watching this, to recall their childhood.
That's why I judge you. Because that's how the nostalgia wins. You put out this stuff, it's a new Willow, it's a new Hocus Pocus, it's a new Gilmore Girls, they're back.
To be fair, it
doesn't matter if the stuff is any good or not, because enough people will watch it to clog the social media feeds and create the impression of success.
But was anyone expecting Hocus Pocus 2 to be an Oscar contender?
No, but I was hoping it'd be a decent movie, just because you have the protection of IP, you have the protection of the brand, so you can have a little fun with it. You can use your imagination and truly update the mythology. And I knew they were never going to do this, but I almost was hoping for a comedic version of It Chapter 2, where the kids from 29 years ago get that scary phone call saying, "Mike, they're back."
That would have been awesome. But has the response been negative like you, or has it been well received?
Well, statistically speaking, to the extent that I've done the research, smart, intelligent, thoughtful moviegoers of sound mind and character have informed us that it's a terrible, terrible movie. However, sad, pathetic, nostalgic losers who can't. No, I'm kidding. I'm just being sure. No, I mean, the people that wanted a Hocus Pocus sequel got what they wanted out of it.
Good.
And I mentioned this in my review, and I think it's important, to the discourse. I don't begrudge the movie for existing. But I do kind of, this is one of the things about the streaming wars that have driven me nuts, is that these films and shows that 20 years ago would have been direct to video, direct to VHS, direct to whatever irrelevancies are now essential, must succeed, big deal pieces in a giant chessboard for global Hollywood domination. And as much as I made fun of the idea of a Space Jam 2 sequel coming 25 years after the first one, and at least that film had $150 million of production value, which, it looks good in theaters.
But it wasn't well received, right? Space Jam 2?
No. And it also cost $150 million, which was nuts for a Space Jam sequel. You cap that at 90 and you hope for the best, even in non-COVID times. It was an okay performing movie on a COVID curve when theaters were just, but again, generally speaking, not to get into something I bring up almost every other day, and I apologize, most of the films that opened amid COVID did about as well as they would have done in non-COVID times, with a few exceptions here and there. So I'm inclined to argue that Space Jam 2, which I know it opened with $31 million. I think it did about 150 worldwide on a 150 budget, did about as well as it would have done in non-COVID times. Yeah, it did 163 million worldwide, which on a 90 million would have been a disappointment, a flop, but nobody would have gotten murdered over it. It was an okay performer on HBO Max, to my knowledge, but again, that stuff's all buried under, pounds and pounds of secrecy. But even that film, my son, who barely was, had seen the first Space Jam once and whatever. He liked it. He liked the sequel. It was entertaining to him. He laughed at some of the jokes, even if he didn't get the references, which is a good test if the jokes work despite, with or without nostalgia. He was bored as silly by Hocus Pocus too. And it was funny. Neither of them have seen the first one. All three of my kids, none of them seen the first one. And my oldest ones, the 15-year-old and the 11-year-old, were both pointing out issues with the sequel that were like, yeah, that was the problem with the first one too. Yeah, that was the problem with the first one too as well.
Oh, wow.
If you go into it with no nostalgia, there's just not a lot of there.
Yeah.
And in 1993, I might argue that a film like Hocus Pocus, that was a PG-rated Disney horror comedy with dead children and sexy witches and two young teen protagonists that both wanted to bone each other, which was just subversive enough in 1993 to make kids think they were getting away with something. This was back when there was a much sharper dividing line between kids films and adult films. Now, you have $200 million all ages PG-13 action fantasies. And frankly, not to be lecherous here, but the one thing that stood out about Hocus Pocus was that it was kind of horny. This film is not horny. I'm not saying it should be, but you're forgetting why people like the first one.
So, bottom line, you're not a fan of Hocus Pocus, but the nostalgia carries it through. You're saying. So if you like,
then you have very, very low standards.
So low standards, but fun-loving individual. Hocus Pocus 2 is for you, is what you're saying.
Save yourself.
Scott Mendelson, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. It's a pleasure.